My fifth anniversary dinner, usually a private affair, had Brenda insisting on a restaurant full of our mutual friends. Mid-toast, she excused herself, then returned giggling with Gary Jenkins, her hand openly wrapped in his arm. Their whispered jokes, his possessive glance, left me isolated at my own table. "Just a little private talk, Dale," she purred, her eyes cutting through me. The fluorescent light in the small Detroit apartment hummed, flickering above Dale Pearson's head. He sat hunched on a worn sofa, a half-empty glass of cheap whiskey sweating on the end table beside him. The television screen, a grainy live feed from a news helicopter, showed his former home on the Chicago North Shore. Squad cars dotted the circular driveway, their blue and red lights painting the manicured lawn. Tactical units moved with practiced caution around the perimeter. He watched, an old man watching ghosts, as a chapter closed in a life that was once perfect, before it began to unravel on an ordinary Tuesday last November. That day, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Dale had been preparing for an afternoon on the golf course, a client meeting pushed back to Friday. But then a call came, an unexpected cancellation. Mr. Henderson's flight out of O'Hare was delayed. He wouldn't be back in the office until late. Dale hung up the phone. The unexpected free time hung heavy. Golf seemed pointless now. A familiar instinct, an itch at the back of his neck, told him to go home. He drove the familiar route from downtown, the Lincoln Park skyline shrinking in his rearview mirror. The stately homes of Lake Forest rose around him, each one a testament to old money and established lives. His own house, a sprawling brick colonial, came into view. As he turned onto the circular drive, a sleek black Audi was parked just beyond his silver sedan, a car he did not recognize. It was parked too close to the front door, a subtle breach of decorum that instantly registered. Brenda hadn't mentioned having company. Dale entered through the kitchen, the heavy oak door closing quietly behind him. The house was usually bustling with activity, but today an unusual quiet pressed in. No housekeeper, no gardener. He took a few steps, shrugging out of his blazer, and then he heard it. Brenda's voice, sharp and cold, cutting through the silence from his home office at the far end of the hall. "Gary, I can't stand this marriage anymore," she said, her voice dropping but still clear. "He monitors every move I make. It's suffocating." Dale froze, his blazer half off his shoulders. Gary? He knew a few Garys, but only one would be in his house, whispering with Brenda, talking about their marriage. Gary Jenkins, their attorney. A sleazy man with slicked back hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Dale had always disliked him. He moved silently, drawn by a morbid curiosity, closer to the office door, careful to stay out of sight. "It's just, I need to feel secure," Brenda continued. "Financially secure. We need to discuss his insurance policy, Gary, the one from his firm." There was a pause, the low murmur of Gary's voice too indistinct to catch. "Yes, of course, documentation ensuring I get everything when he dies," Brenda stated, her tone flat, almost clinical. "We already went over the numbers. $3 million is the minimum, Gary. I won't settle for less." A cold knot tightened in Dale's stomach. $3 million. When he dies. The words hung in the air, heavy and solid. Then her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a cruel lightness in her tone. "The anniversary dinner. It's perfect. No one will question food poisoning." And the shellfish allergy was a brilliant touch, wasn't it? Dale's mind reeled. His fifth anniversary. It was in 3 weeks. Brenda had insisted just last week that they have a quiet dinner at home. Just the two of us, without any staff. He remembered arguing briefly about it, wanting to go out, but she had been adamant. No distractions. A private evening. He backed away, slowly, silently, his hand brushing the cool porcelain of the counter. The blood drained from his face, leaving a prickling chill. He turned, retrieved his keys from the bowl by the door, and slipped out of the house as quietly as he had entered. The black Audi still sat in his driveway, an arrogant, ominous presence. He drove aimlessly at first, the streets blurring, the beautiful houses suddenly oppressive. He found himself downtown, the familiar hum of the city a distant roar. He pulled into a parking garage, then walked, his steps measured, to a bar he sometimes visited after work. A dark, anonymous place with red leather booths. He ordered a double scotch, then another. in another. Four of them, amber and burning, went down his throat. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that settled deep in his bones. Brenda wanted him dead. The thought was simple, brutal, undeniable. Fine. Dale Pearson would die, but on his terms, not hers. The bitterness settled over Dale like a heavy blanket in the days that followed. He began to see Brenda with a brutal clarity, stripping away the layers of affection he had once perceived. Her subtle manipulations now seemed glaringly obvious. The way she had always steered conversations toward his life insurance, framed as concern for their future, yet always pressing for the maximum payout. "What if something happens, Dale?" she'd say, her hand softly on his arm, a performance he had fallen for every time. Then there was the slow, insidious distancing from his friends and family. A critical comment about his sister's flightiness, a gentle dismissal of a college friend's outdated sense of humor, always delivered with a feigned reluctance. Plans with others became increasingly difficult to make, until he realized his social circle had shrunk almost entirely to her orbit. His brothers, his closest friends from college, all now felt like distant acquaintances. He recalled the unexplained absences, the evenings she claimed to be with girlfriends he'd never met, or the way she'd abruptly end mysterious phone calls when he entered a room. The growing coldness in their marriage, which he had attributed to the natural settling of a relationship, now felt like a calculated withdrawal. He remembered their whirlwind courtship. He was 40, feeling the tick of the biological clock, eager to settle down, to build a future. Brenda had been 28, vivacious, seemingly devoted. He had rushed into it, desperate for the connection, for the picture of stability she painted. He had mistaken her intense focus, her fierce determination, for passion. Now he knew it was calculation, a careful targeting of a man with a good job, a big house, and a substantial life insurance policy. For 2 weeks, Dale played the part of the oblivious, loving husband. It was a performance that grated on his soul. He bought expensive flowers, long-stemmed red roses one week, delicate lilies the next, leaving them on the kitchen counter for her to find. He suggested romantic getaways, a weekend in Napa, a cozy cabin up north. Each time she demurred, citing work commitments or a sudden migraine. He even increased her allowance by $1,000 a month, framing it as a surprise gift, a token of his appreciation. "You deserve it, honey," he'd said, watching her carefully. Her eyes, he noticed, always assessed him. "You're in an unusually good mood lately," Brenda remarked one evening, her fork poised over a grilled salmon fillet. Her gaze was sharp, probing. He felt like a specimen under a microscope. He forced a smile, a little too wide, a little too bright. "Just realized how lucky I am, Brenda. With you, this house. Life's too short not to appreciate what you have." Her eyes narrowed slightly, then a slow, unsettling smile spread across her face. "Very short indeed," she replied, her voice soft, almost a purr. The casualness of the statement sent a fresh shiver down his spine. The urge to confront her, to shout, to expose her clawed at his throat. He swallowed it down, remembering his resolve. Self-preservation. That was the only thing that mattered now. He knew then that a simple divorce wouldn't be enough. She would take everything, and he would still be a target. He had to disappear completely. Leave no trace, no breadcrumbs, nothing for Brenda to chase. He needed to become a ghost. The planning was meticulous, a silent obsession that consumed every waking hour. He started with a modest apartment in Detroit, renting it under the name Paul Evans. It was a nondescript place, a 2-bedroom unit in a brick building on the city's west side, far from anything that screamed Chicago North Shore. He transferred $200,000, his emergency fund, through a convoluted chain of offshore accounts he'd set up years ago, a relic from a brief, adventurous phase in his early career. Money in, money out, untraceable. Through old, questionable connections he had made in college, he acquired forged documents, a new driver's license, social security card, and a birth certificate, all under the name Paul Evans. He began to gradually move personal items, not clothes or furniture, but small, sentimental things. His grandfather's pocket watch, a framed photo of his parents, a worn copy of his favorite Hemingway novel. These went into a storage unit in a different part of the city, carefully packed away. Finally, he purchased a disguise kit, bottles of dark brown hair dye, blue contact lenses to obscure his natural hazel, a variety of glasses frames, and a selection of convincing facial hair pieces. Dale Pearson was slowly, deliberately erasing himself. The hardest part of becoming a ghost wasn't changing his name or his appearance. It was the absolute dismantling of who Dale Pearson was, right down to the biological markers authorities used to identify the dead. DNA and dental records were the bedrock of identification, and he had to fool them both. This required a level of manipulation that made his stomach clench, even in his current state of cold resolve. He thought of Dr. Anya Sharma, his dentist for the past decade. A few years back, he had helped her navigate a messy divorce, providing financial advice that saved her practice from ruin. It had been a complex case, her husband trying to bleed her dry, but Dale had found the loopholes, secured her assets. Now he needed a favor, a significant one. He called her office, sounding as normal as possible. "Anya," he began, his voice calm. "It's Dale. Listen, I have an unusual request. I'm dealing with a complicated insurance dispute, and it involves my dental records. I need to access them and, frankly, make a few adjustments to the digital files." Anya's voice, usually warm, went stiff. "Dale, you know I can't just adjust patient records. That's highly unethical, illegal even." "I understand," Dale said, letting a hint of disappointment color his tone. "It's just this dispute could have serious repercussions. Remember when you were almost bankrupt, Anya? Those loans from your husband's family? The practice on the verge of collapse? My advice saved you from losing everything. This is a fraction of that trouble for me." A small adjustment. There was a long silence on the line, punctuated only by her soft sigh. "Give me a day, Dale," she finally said, her voice tight. "I'll see what I can do." 2 days later, a secure email arrived with digital copies of his dental x-rays. Dale then spent hours in his rented Detroit apartment, hunched over his laptop. He used a specialized medical imaging software, the kind a former client named Mark had recommended to him years ago for a stock investment in radiology tech. Mark, a quiet man with thick glasses, had explained the nuances of digital image manipulation. Dale carefully altered specific fillings, created the illusion of a missing tooth that had never been pulled, and shifted the alignment of a molar. It was precise work, agonizingly slow. He saved the modified files, then sent them back to Anya. Another phone call, more strained this time. "They're uploaded," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Replace the originals. You owe me, Dale. Big." "Consider it handled," he replied, feeling a sliver of relief mixed with profound shame. He had compromised an honest woman, but he rationalized it as survival. For DNA, his plan was grimmer, born from grim necessity. He knew fire degraded genetic material. A severely burned body, if identified quickly and without extensive forensic scrutiny, could pass. He hoped the altered dental records, combined with specific personal effects he would leave behind, his watch, a ring, a wallet with his old ID, would be enough. And Brenda, her pressure as the grieving widow demanding a quick resolution, would ideally prevent a deeper, more comprehensive DNA analysis. She would want closure and his insurance payout fast. His new identity, Paul Evans, needed more than just a driver's license. He needed to be able to move, truly disappear. He contacted another old client, Dave, a man who had built a small fortune importing specialty goods from South America, which Dale knew was a euphemism for contraband. Dave had connections everywhere, especially around border security. $50,000 in crisp hundreds, handed over in a greasy diner booth at 3 in the morning, bought him a second passport, valid and untraceable to Dale Pearson. It had Paul Evans's face, his new birth date, his new place of origin. In the quiet days leading up to the planned disappearance, a thought occurred to him, a flicker of foresight. As Brenda moved about the house oblivious, he began to collect small, seemingly insignificant items. Strands of her long, dark hair from her brush, lipstick-stained napkins from the breakfast table, a wine glass carefully wiped clean of his own prints, bearing hers. He placed them in separate, sealed plastic bags. He wasn't sure how they would be useful or even if they would, but having her DNA and fingerprints seemed prudent, a detail that in time would prove invaluable. His original plan had been to vanish during a business trip to Europe, scheduled for the following month. A convenient accident, far from home, would ensure a clean break. Fate, or something colder and more calculating, intervened on the night of November 17th. Dale had just left the dimly lit bar where he'd met his document contact, Dave, the heavy envelope containing his new Paul Evans passport now tucked deep inside his jacket. The rain was biblical, a relentless sheets of water that reduced visibility to nothing more than the tunnel created by his Mercedes high beams. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, navigating the winding forest roads that led back to his North Shore home. A few miles from his house, in a stretch where the trees grew thick and the streetlights were scarce, he saw it. A car, small and dark, stopped dead in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. He slowed, his wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. As he approached, the car suddenly accelerated, tires squealing, and vanished around the next bend, leaving him alone in the deluge. An uneasy feeling settled in his gut. He pulled his Mercedes to the side of the road, the tires crunching on gravel. The rain hammered against the roof, an insistent drum. Dale killed the engine, the sudden silence heavy, broken only by the natural world. He stepped out, pulling his collar up against the chill, and walked slowly toward where the mysterious car had been. His headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the asphalt. Then he saw it. A body. A man, roughly his height and build, sprawled awkwardly on the wet pavement. He was dressed in dirty, threadbare clothes, the kind a man without a home might wear. Dale knelt, the cold water soaking his knees. The man's eyes were open, staring blankly at the stormy sky. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle. Someone had hit him and fled. The thought was sickening. Instinctively, Dale reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Then a chilling thought, sharp and clear, cut through the shock. The road was deserted, no houses nearby, no surveillance cameras. The torrential rain was washing away all evidence, every tire track, every possible clue. This wasn't just an accident, it was an opportunity. A brutal, horrific, undeniable sign from the universe. Adrenaline, cold and metallic, flooded his veins, overwhelming his moral qualms. His movements became automatic, disconnected from the man he knew himself to be. He gritted his teeth, seized the dead man's shoulders, and with a grunt, dragged the surprisingly heavy body to his car. He wrestled it into the passenger seat, the head lolling unnervingly against the headrest. The smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic, filled the car. He drove another half-mile, his mind racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew this stretch of road well, a sharp, blind curve that overlooked a deep, rock-strewn ravine, a notorious spot for fatal accidents, a place where people sometimes lost control. He stopped the car at the edge. The ravine gaped below, a black abyss in the stormy night. He reached over, fastened the seatbelt around the corpse, securing it in place. Then, with deliberate hands, he removed his own expensive tailored jacket, forcing it onto the dead man. He took his wallet, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and a few $100s, and slid it into the jacket's inner pocket. Finally, he pulled off his gold wedding band, the symbol of his betrayal and his escape, and with a shudder forced it onto the dead man's finger. He looked at the face, a stranger's face, now wearing his clothes, his ring, holding his identity. "Goodbye, Dale Pearson," he whispered, the words lost in the roar of the rain. He got out, leaving the driver's side door open. He took a deep breath, his lungs burning, then sprinted a few yards back. He reached into the car, shifted the gear lever into drive, and gave the gas pedal a final hard push. The Mercedes lurched forward, gaining speed rapidly. At the last moment, Dale jumped clear, landing hard on the muddy ground as the car shot toward the edge. It flew, a dark missile against the gray sky, hanging suspended for a sickening second before plummeting about 50 feet. There was a deafening crunch of metal, a burst of orange and red as the fuel tank ignited. Flames erupted from the wreckage against the rocks below, illuminating the rainy night in a grotesque, flickering dance. Covered in mud, his hands shaking, Dale watched the inferno from the edge of the ravine. A horrific mixture of disgust, fear, and a strange, undeniable liberation washed over him. Dale Pearson was dead. The roar of the flames slowly faded into the incessant drumming of the rain. Dale, covered in mud and smelling of smoke, turned from the abyss. He stumbled through the dense woods, the dark branches clawing at his face, the slick earth treacherous beneath his feet. His hidden cache, a small insulated shed he'd rented months ago in a rural area, felt impossibly far. The cold bit into his bones, but the adrenaline still coursed through him, keeping the worst of the shivers at bay. When he finally reached the shed, breath coming in ragged gasps, he fumbled with the padlock, his fingers numb. Inside, a small, practical sedan sat waiting, along with a duffel bag containing his new life. He shed his ruined clothes, stripping naked in the cold, and quickly pulled on a fresh set of jeans, a flannel shirt, and a heavy jacket. Then came the transformation. He dyed his naturally dark hair a nondescript gray, watching the color take hold in a cracked mirror. He glued on a neatly trimmed mustache, adjusted the blue contact lenses, and settled a pair of plain wire-rimmed glasses onto his nose. The man who stared back was Paul Evans, a modest retired accountant. He was unremarkable, forgettable. He drove away from the shed, heading west, away from Chicago, toward Detroit. The city lights, when they finally appeared, felt like a distant promise of anonymity. His new apartment was exactly as described: small, 2 bedrooms, chipped paint, a view of a brick wall. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling colonial he had left behind, a chasm between 2 lives. That first night, alone in the silence of the shabby apartment, Dale stood before the bathroom mirror. The stranger with gray hair and a mustache stared back. "What kind of sick bastard am I?" he whispered, the words rasping in the quiet room. The man in the mirror, older, grayer, with tired eyes, offered no answer. His earlier justification, self-preservation, rang hollow in the cold, empty space. He had taken a life, an innocent life. The nightmares began immediately. He saw Arthur, the homeless man, sitting up in the plummeting Mercedes, his eyes wide with terror, his lips forming the question, "Why me divine?" Just as the flames engulfed the car, Dale woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the smell of burning metal and flesh vivid in his imagination. Sleep offered no escape. It only brought the horrific echo of his choices. In the days that followed, Dale forced himself to maintain the routine of Paul Evans. He bought groceries, walked the anonymous streets, and sat in coffee shops, always with a newspaper, always observing. He meticulously followed the news of his own death, watching from the safe anonymity of Detroit. The local Chicago news channels, then national reports, detailed the horrific car accident on the North Shore. The charred remains were identified as Dale Pearson, based on his wallet found on the body and the distinctive dental records provided by his dentist. Brenda, the grieving widow, played her part perfectly for the cameras. She stood draped in black, her face carefully composed, a single tear often tracing a path down her cheek. Her performance was almost convincing, if you didn't know the truth. Dale watched, a cold anger building within him, as his former business partner, Jim, offered awkward condolences to Brenda on live television, his face a mask of sorrow. Other colleagues and friends echoed their sympathy, none of them knowing the woman they consoled was a killer, and the man they mourned was still very much alive. Gary Jenkins was constantly by her side, a dark, reassuring presence, his hand often on her elbow, whispering into her ear. This entire ordeal, this terrible shift in fate, made him realize that life's costly choices often unfold in ways no one can predict. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The news then turned to the inevitable, the commencement of the insurance payout process. The millions Brenda would receive were discussed, a cold, clinical figure reinforcing the motive, cementing his resolve. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting. The insurance company predictably initiated a standard investigation into Dale Pearson's accidental death. It was routine, a necessary step before releasing millions. Dale, as Paul Evans, tracked their progress through hushed reports in financial news outlets and whispers he overheard in the quiet corners of Detroit diners. He learned that small inconsistencies were already beginning to emerge in their findings. The particular model of his Mercedes, a high-performance vehicle not entirely suited for the winding, unlit forest road, and the strange, out-of-the-way location of the accident, a place he rarely frequented unless he was deliberately trying to avoid traffic. These details, small as they were, hinted at something more than a simple loss of control. After a few weeks of settling into his new identity, the quiet anonymity of Detroit began to feel less like a haven and more like a cage. He needed to see, to confirm, to understand the extent of his betrayal. He started driving back to the North Shore, a 3-hour journey he made several times a week, always under the cloak of night or during busy daylight hours when he could blend into the background. He began observing Brenda. Discreetly, from the driver's seat of his nondescript sedan, he'd park a few blocks from his former home, watching her comings and goings. He noticed her clandestine meetings with Gary Jenkins becoming more frequent, less cautious. At first, they were quick, hushed encounters in parking lots or at the back of quiet cafes. But as time wore on, as Brenda's public morning facade began to crack, their interactions grew bolder. One evening, he followed her to a secluded, upscale restaurant in a neighboring town, a place far from the usual North Shore haunts. He secured a table in a dark corner, his back to the wall, his eyes hidden behind his glasses, scanning the room. She was there, in a red dress he had bought her, sitting opposite Gary Jenkins. They were laughing, their heads close, their hands occasionally touching across the white tablecloth. There was an intimacy in their gestures, a casual ease that spoke of a long-standing familiarity. It was a stark contrast to her public displays of grief, a performance that now seemed even more grotesque. A profound new sense of betrayal washed over Dale. It wasn't just the murder plot, not just the financial greed. It was the desecration of his past life, of their shared memories, however flawed they might have been. He saw the way Gary looked at her, the proprietary air he exuded, and he understood. This wasn't a recent affair. It was something that had been simmering, perhaps even thriving, beneath the surface of his marriage for far longer than he had allowed himself to imagine. The rage, cold and hard, settled deep within him. Brenda must pay, he decided. She would not just benefit from his death, she would suffer for it. He began to meticulously document their movements. He bought a small, high-resolution camera, disguised as a car key fob, and a few covert recording devices. He took photos of Brenda and Gary together, in restaurants, leaving her house late at night, in his car. He recorded fragments of their conversations, catching snippets of laughter, suggestive tones, the casual familiarity of lovers. He was building a case, not just for the insurance company, but for a deeper, more personal justice. He thought back to the items he had collected in his North Shore home, the strands of Brenda's hair, the lipstick-stained napkins, the wine glass with her fingerprints. He had collected them out of a vague, unsettling intuition. Now their potential value became clear. They were keys, silent witnesses that could link her directly to Arthur's death, or to some other crime if he was careful. His fake death had bought him not just survival, not just the anonymity to vanish, but the perfect cover to truly expose Brenda. He was a ghost, a silent observer, invisible to the world, yet watching her every move. The guilt over Arthur's death remained a heavy burden, a constant ache beneath his ribs. It was a price he had paid, a terrible, unforgivable act. But that guilt, rather than breaking him, hardened his resolve. It became fuel, a grim determination to ensure that his sacrifice, however morally bankrupt, would not be in vain. Brenda would be brought to justice. The weeks that followed Dale's discovery of Brenda and Gary's affair became a blur of precise, methodical action. Operating as Paul Evans, he began to subtly leak anonymous information to the lead insurance investigator assigned to his death. He started with small, easily verifiable facts. Brenda's sudden, lavish spending habits, a new designer handbag, an expensive European car, an impromptu trip to the Caribbean. He included observations about her remarkably quick recovery from grief, a detail that, while perhaps not damning on its own, would certainly stir initial doubts in the mind of any seasoned investigator. He framed these tips as coming from a concerned family friend who found Brenda's behavior uncharacteristic. But tips were not enough. He needed concrete evidence, something undeniable. He needed to catch Brenda and Gary discussing the accident on tape, their words a confession. He began to master his surveillance techniques, using his intimate knowledge of Brenda's routines and Gary's predictable, almost arrogant schedule. He knew Gary always drove his sleek black Audi to a specific high-end gym on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, parking in the same secluded corner of the lot. He knew Brenda would often meet him there afterward for a post-workout drink at the bar next door. One Thursday, as Gary entered the gym, Dale moved. He had a small, specialized toolkit he'd purchased online. With practiced ease, he created a staged malfunction in Gary's Audi, a loose battery cable, easily fixed, but enough to require Gary to pop the hood and spend a few minutes fiddling. While Gary was inside, Dale planted a miniature recording device, no bigger than a thumbnail, under the dashboard, secured with industrial-strength adhesive. The device was voice-activated, designed to capture crystal-clear audio even in a noisy environment. He waited. 2 hours later, Gary emerged from the gym, Brenda by his side. They got into his car, and Dale, hidden in his own vehicle across the street, watched as Gary grumbled about the damn car, and Brenda offered a dismissive laugh. He listened later through the playback on his secure laptop as their conversation began, casual at first, then chillingly specific. "That was quite a scare, wasn't it?" Brenda said, her voice light, almost giddy. "When you told me he'd actually gone over, I almost couldn't believe it. After all our planning for the anniversary dinner." Gary chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "I know, it was almost too easy. Just serendipitous. The car, the ravine, the rain. Perfect storm. No one questions a drunk driving accident. And the shellfish allergy," Brenda added, a note of triumph in her voice. "That was a stroke of genius, Gary, having it so prominently on his medical records. If the dinner had gone through, they would have written it off instantly. Food poisoning, massive allergic reaction. They wouldn't have even looked for anything else." Gary's voice, smug and self-satisfied, confirmed it. "Exactly. It all lined up. The altered medical records, the life insurance policy, your quick action after the tragedy. It would have worked perfectly, Brenda, just a different method." Dale listened, his blood running cold, then boiling. They were celebrating his near murder, discussing it like a business transaction. The rage was a physical presence in his chest, a burning coal. He carefully cut the relevant audio, edited out the innocuous parts, and compressed the damning conversation into a single, undeniable file. He burned the audio file onto a blank CD, packaged it in a plain manila envelope, and mailed it anonymously to the insurance company. He included a short typewritten note. The accidental death of Dale Pearson was no accident. Listen closely. The truth about his widow's intentions and her accomplice is clearer than you think. He signed it, a concerned observer. The response was swift and decisive. The insurance company, armed with concrete evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud and potentially murder, escalated the entire investigation. It was out of their hands now. Local law enforcement was involved, a full criminal inquiry. Dale knew he had to be incredibly careful now, more than ever. The police would be thorough. He had to balance his relentless pursuit of justice with the absolute necessity of maintaining his own survival, his freedom. But the trap was set. He anticipated the police raid, the flashing lights, the forced entry into his former home. He knew his evidence, his meticulous planning, would be enough to bring them down. The flickering live feed on the television screen in Dale's shabby Detroit apartment brought the story full circle. Police cars, sirens muted on the broadcast, swarmed his former North Shore home. He watched as Brenda Olson and Gary Jenkins, their faces grim, were led out in handcuffs, arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. A strange mix of vindication and profound emptiness settled in his chest. His elaborate revenge was complete, but the cost weighed heavy. He considered stepping forward, revealing his survival, finally bringing the full truth to light. But the risk was too immense. He would be implicated in Arthur's death, losing the freedom he had so desperately fought for. His new life as Paul Evans, quiet and lonely, was safe from Brenda's schemes. He made the agonizing decision to remain dead, accepting his self-imposed exile in the constant shadow of his past. Brenda and Gary would face justice, but Dale would live with his own choices, forever haunted by Arthur. He raised his cheap whiskey glass in a silent toast, a wordless apology for the life he had used. The nightmares of Arthur still came, but now a grim resolve settled in Dale's heart. His old life was truly gone, replaced by a gray, subdued reality, a solitary existence born of betrayal and desperate survival. This was the ultimate price he paid for outsmarting death. A life lived as a ghost. Life as Paul Evans settled into a rhythm, one defined by monotony and a pervasive grayness. The small Detroit apartment, once a temporary refuge, had become a permanent cage. His days were a careful construction of anonymity, trips to the public library, where he'd read newspapers from other cities, long walks through unfamiliar parks, his head down, observing without being observed, meals taken at quiet, out-of-the-way diners where no one asked questions. He paid in cash, spoke little, and faded into the background like dust. The guilt over Arthur's death remained, a dull, persistent ache beneath his ribs. It wasn't the sharp, explosive pain of those first few weeks, but a deep, ingrained understanding of the enormity of his act. He had extinguished a life, however overlooked, to save his own. That reality, cold and unforgiving, was his constant companion. He followed the news of Brenda and Gary's legal proceedings with a detached clinical interest. The trial was a media circus, plastered across Chicago's local channels and picked up by national tabloids. The evidence he had supplied, coupled with the detailed investigation, painted a clear picture of their conspiracy. The recordings, the financial trail, the damning dental records he had put into place, all of it came out. Ugly details of their affair, spanning years, were laid bare for the world to see. Brenda's icy demeanor contrasted sharply with Gary's blustering denials, but the facts were undeniable. The verdict came down after a few weeks of testimony. Guilty, both of them. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud. Lengthy prison sentences followed. Years that would strip them of their wealth, their freedom, their carefully constructed lives. He watched the final reports, the handcuffs, the somber procession to the awaiting vans. There was no surge of jubilation, no triumphant cheer, only a hollow satisfaction, a confirmation of the emptiness that now defined him. The revenge was complete, but it had left him with nothing but a void. His nightmares continued, a nightly penance. Arthur was always there, not screaming now, not asking, "Why me?" but simply staring, his eyes wide, a silent, knowing accusation that pierced through Dale's carefully constructed defenses. He would wake, drenched in sweat, gasping, only to face the silent, empty apartment, the reality that his freedom was built on another man's grave. One afternoon, a sharp jolt of fear ripped through his composure. He was turning a corner onto a busy street, head down, when he glanced up and saw him. John Davies, a former colleague from his investment firm, walking towards him, talking on his phone. John was looking straight ahead, but for a split second, their eyes almost met. Dale froze, then instinctively ducked into a bookstore, pretending to browse a shelf, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited for several minutes, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow before venturing back out. John was gone. The incident, fleeting as it was, sharpened his paranoia, reinforcing the need for constant vigilance. One mistake, one casual glance, and his entire new existence could crumble. He often pondered the nature of his freedom. He wasn't behind bars, but he was undeniably imprisoned. A prisoner of his past, a prisoner of his new identity, a prisoner of his own solitude. He had traded a gilded cage, filled with a deceitful wife and a life he thought he wanted, for an invisible one. He could walk anywhere, go anywhere, but he could never truly connect, never truly be himself. His only true companions were the quiet solitude and the relentless echoes of his past. He developed a new ritual. Once a week on a Tuesday, he would visit a quiet local cemetery, a small plot of land filled with forgotten names and weathered headstones. He would sit on a cold stone bench watching the leaves fall, listening to the wind whisper through the old oaks. It was a strange solace he found there among the dead. He was, after all, one of them, a ghost among ghosts, waiting for his own true final reckoning. Years bled into each other, stretching the gap between Dale Pearson's death and Paul Evans's quiet existence. Brenda and Gary's conviction had faded from the headlines, their names now just grim footnotes in local legal history. For Dale, the isolation deepened, the silence of his apartment becoming a heavier presence with each passing season. His new identity, Paul Evans, had become less a disguise and more a skin. The memory of Dale Pearson, the man with the high-finance job and the big house, felt like a story he'd read in a book, distant and almost unreal. The initial acute guilt over Arthur's death had dulled, though it never entirely vanished. It was now a part of him, like an old scar, present but no longer raw. He carried it, a silent burden in his solitary walks and his anonymous meals. He longed for connection, for someone to truly see him, to understand the labyrinthine path that had led him here. But the risk was too great. Every new face was a potential threat, every shared confidence a vulnerability. He even considered therapy once, fleetingly, only to dismiss it with a bitter laugh. What would he tell a therapist? That he faked his death, implicated his wife in his murder, and used the body of a homeless man as a proxy? The thought alone was absurd. Seeking some form of redemption, a way to assuage the gnawing emptiness, he began to volunteer at a local soup kitchen downtown. It was anonymous work, ladling stew, washing dishes, handing out stale bread. Here, among the truly disadvantaged, his own misfortune seemed almost trivial. These people had lost everything, not through calculated deceit, but through cruel twists of fate, economic hardship, or simply bad luck. It was a sobering perspective, a reminder that while his path was self-made, the consequences were equally real. He found a strange, fleeting solace in these small acts of charity, a brief escape from the relentless echo of his own past. One cold winter evening, as he wiped down a table, a familiar face looked up at him from the line for coffee. His breath hitched. Frank Miller, a former colleague from his old investment firm, a man he hadn't seen in over a decade. Frank's face was gaunt, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollowed by a life on the streets. He was just another ghost in the city, but to Dale he was a walking, talking piece of his past. Frank stared, his brow furrowed, then his eyes widened in recognition. "Dale?" he rasped, his voice hoarse, disbelief coloring the single syllable. Dale's heart hammered. He gripped the edge of the table, forcing his voice to remain calm, even. "I think you have me mistaken, sir. My name is Paul Evans." Frank shook his head slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. No, I don't think so. I remember you, Dale Pearson. Always wore those fancy silver cufflinks to the company Christmas party. Looked like tiny golf balls or something. Nobody else had 'em. I know it's you." A cold wave of panic washed over Dale. The cufflinks. He had forgotten about them. A small, insignificant detail from a life he had painstakingly dismantled. Abandoned. He felt the carefully constructed walls of Paul Evans begin to crumble. His cover was blown. His carefully orchestrated anonymity was on the brink of exposure. "I need to go," Dale said. His voice clipped, barely a whisper. He turned abruptly, abandoning his half-wiped table, abandoning the lukewarm stew, abandoning his small acts of charity. He walked out into the biting Detroit night, leaving Frank staring after him, a ghost staring at another ghost. The encounter reignited his paranoia, a firestorm in his gut. He had to disappear again. Deeper this time. The city that had offered him sanctuary now felt like a trap. The fragile peace he had built, the tenuous safety, had shattered. Paul Evans, it seemed, was as vulnerable as Dale Pearson. The encounter with Frank sent Dale into a spiraling freefall of renewed paranoia and fear. The carefully constructed peace he had found in his Detroit routine shattered in an instant. He didn't even go back to his apartment, grabbing only his emergency bag, a small backpack containing cash, his Paul Evans passport, and a few essentials from the trunk of his car. He drove aimlessly at first, then with increasing desperation, finding refuge in a string of cheap motels and forgotten towns along the Michigan-Ohio border. For several anxious days, he holed up in these anonymous rooms, the flickering televisions and stale cigarette smoke, a backdrop to his racing thoughts. Frank had seen him. Frank, a man from his past, now living on the streets, with nothing to lose and perhaps a score to settle. What if Frank went to the authorities? What if he saw a news report about Brenda and Gary, connected the dots, and decided to cash in? The intricate web of lies he had woven, once so robust, now felt fragile, ready to unravel at any moment. His previous meticulous planning, the sense of control he had felt, now seemed like naive optimism. He realized he needed a new identity, a new location, something even more obscure than Paul Evans, the modest retired accountant. Paul Evans had too much backstory, too many details that could be traced back to his brief, compromised existence in Detroit. Paul Evans must also die, just as Dale Pearson had. He made the difficult call to Dave, his old connection for forged documents. Dave's voice, a gravelly whisper on the secure line, was devoid of warmth. "Another one, huh, Dale? Or should I say Paul?" "I need a new one," Dale replied, his voice tight. "Simpler, less traceable, something that doesn't scream retired professional." Dave was silent for a moment, a calculated pause. "This is getting complicated, friend. The risks are higher now, much higher." He named a price, significantly higher than the last. $50,000 for the Paul Evans passport felt like a bargain now. This time it was $75,000. Dale didn't argue. His options were dwindling. His life savings, once a comfortable cushion, were steadily depleting. "Cash," he simply stated. "Of course," Dave replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Same protocols. Meet me in 2 days. West side of Cleveland. You know the spot." Dale agreed, his gut clenching. He made a stop at a remote ATM, withdrawing a large sum, the crisp bills feeling heavy in his hand. Each transaction, each new set of documents, felt like another nail in the coffin of his old life, and perhaps even his new one. His new existence would be one of deeper isolation, constant vigilance, and an ever-present fear of exposure. He decided he would move further west, away from the familiar Midwestern landscape, to a smaller, more remote town, a place where no one would look for a man like him. He chose the name John Smith, the most common name imaginable, a name that would allow him to disappear completely into the white noise of society. It was almost comical, the irony of it all. The harder he tried to disappear, the more visible his desperation became. The more he had to spend, the more he had to risk. Each step deeper into anonymity was also a step deeper into a life of self-imposed exile, a life defined by what he wasn't, rather than who he was. The ghost of Arthur lingered, a silent, reproachful presence. His freedom, Dale realized, was nothing more than an illusion, bought at an unbearable price and maintained by constant fear. He was running, not from justice, but from himself. John Smith found himself in a tiny town in rural Nebraska, a place so small it felt almost forgotten by the rest of the world. The landscape was flat, stretching endlessly under a vast, indifferent sky, broken only by fields of corn and distant, solitary farmhouses. It was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the North Shore, the bustling streets of Detroit. Here, anonymity was less a cloak and more the natural state of things. He secured a meager apartment above a hardware store, the scent of sawdust and metal a constant presence. He took on odd jobs, helping a farmer repair fences, stacking shelves at the local grocery, shoveling snow for elderly residents. His hands, once accustomed to the soft leather of briefcases and the click of computer keyboards, grew calloused and rough. It was hard, honest manual labor, a brutal contrast to his past, but it provided a strange, unexpected form of peace. The physical exhaustion often dulled the mental anguish, allowing him to sleep more soundly, though Arthur's ghost still lingered at the edges of his dreams. Loneliness, however, remained a profound, aching presence. He spent his evenings alone, eating simple meals, reading borrowed paperbacks from the tiny town library. He started frequenting the local diner, a dusty place with chipped formica counters and the perpetual smell of frying bacon. He'd sit in a corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee, observing the quiet lives around him. Farmers discussing crops, housewives trading gossip, teenagers dreaming of escape. It was there he met Sarah, a waitress, her face etched with the lines of hard work, but her eyes held a spark of genuine warmth. She was quick, efficient, and observant. She noticed his quiet demeanor, the way he always sat alone, never meeting anyone's gaze for too long. "Regular today, honey?" she'd ask, her voice soft with a slight prairie twang. "Another black coffee?" He'd nod, offering a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes, ma'am, that'd be fine." Sarah, undeterred by his reticence, would linger a moment longer. "New to town, ain't you? Don't see many new faces round here." Dale, or John as he now was, would feel the familiar tension in his shoulders. He was torn between his desperate need for anonymity and a yearning for the simple human connection she offered. "Just passing through," he'd offer, or "came for the quiet." Vague, non-committal answers, carefully constructed to deflect any real inquiry. But Sarah was persistent, not pushy, but genuinely kind. She'd share snippets of her own simple life, her garden, her grandkids, the unpredictable weather. She talked about the local high school football team, the price of corn, the annual county fair. She didn't press him for details, merely offered her own, a quiet invitation to join the human race again. A faint flicker of hope, almost forgotten, stirred within Dale. A yearning for something resembling a normal life, a life where he didn't have to look over his shoulder, where he could truly speak his mind, truly connect. He found himself lingering a little longer at the diner, drawn by her unassuming presence. He struggled with the moral dilemma that simmered beneath the surface of his new routine. Could he truly build a new life, a good life, on a foundation of such profound lies and a single horrific act? Could John Smith, the quiet, hardworking man, ever truly atone for the sins of Dale Pearson? The image of Arthur now appeared less in nightmares and more as a quiet, reflective presence during his waking hours, a constant reminder of the profound debt he owed. He wondered if true redemption was possible for a man who had chosen such a brutal, selfish path to freedom. Over the next few months, Dale's cautious interactions with Sarah deepened, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He found himself drawn to her genuine kindness, the unvarnished simplicity of her life. He started to linger at the diner, not just for coffee, but for her easy conversation, her unforced laughter. They began to spend time together outside the diner. Short walks along the dusty county roads, quiet meals at her small farmhouse, evenings spent on her porch, watching the stars blaze across the vast Nebraska sky. Dale had invented a convincing backstory for John Smith, one he had rehearsed countless times in his head. A widower from a small town in rural Iowa, his wife lost to a long illness. He'd moved west for a fresh start, seeking anonymity after the grief became too much. He carefully crafted details. A non-existent small town, a vague description of his wife's generic illness, a mention of selling off a modest family farm. It was plausible yet impossible to verify for anyone not actively investigating him. The lie, however, weighed heavily on him, a constant, dull throb beneath the surface of their growing connection. It was a chasm he had to navigate every single day, a tightrope walk between honesty and self-preservation. Sarah, sensing his hidden pain, never pressed for details. She offered quiet empathy, a steady hand, a gentle smile. He saw in her eyes a shared understanding of loss, a recognition of something unspoken. He felt the beginnings of affection, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that both thrilled and terrified him. He struggled with the growing desire to confess, to lay bare the truth of Dale Pearson, the elaborate deceit, the profound moral compromises. The thought of losing Sarah's trust, of watching her genuine warmth turn to revulsion, was a new, agonizing fear. But the alternative, to continue building a life on such a fundamental lie, felt increasingly unbearable. His hard-won freedom felt less like liberation and more like an isolating prison. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching a fiery Nebraska sunset paint the sky, Sarah shared a deeply personal story. Her voice was soft, laced with a familiar sorrow. "My husband, Mark," she began, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He passed almost 10 years ago now. Just dropped dead one day, working in the fields. Heart attack. No warning. One minute he was there, the next, gone. It took me years to even feel like breathing again. But you keep going, don't you? You have to." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You never really get over it, but you learn to live with the empty space. It sounds like you know that feeling, John." Her vulnerability, Her raw honesty about her own journey through grief and recovery made Dale acutely aware of the chasm of deceit that lay between them. He felt a profound pang of shame, a crushing weight of his own calculated lies. He nodded, unable to speak, the invented grief of John Smith suddenly feeling like a mockery of her real pain. He realized then, with a sickening clarity, the profound impossibility of a future built on such a foundation of lies. He couldn't share his true self with her. He couldn't ask her to love a ghost. The simple, honest life she offered was one he could never truly enter. Not as long as Dale Pearson remained buried beneath layers of deceit. The ghost of Arthur seemed to watch him more intently now, less an accuser, more a silent judge of his agonizing choices. The realization of the impossibility of a future with Sarah settled on Dale like a shroud. It was a painful, agonizing truth. He loved the quiet life she offered, the simple warmth, the genuine connection. But he couldn't taint it with his past, with the elaborate web of lies and the horrific act that had granted him this freedom. He made the difficult, heart-wrenching decision to end it, to protect her from the dark shadow of Dale Pearson. He began by slowly, subtly distancing himself. He skipped a few of their usual walks, citing sudden chores or a vague feeling of tiredness. He stopped lingering at the diner, making his visits shorter, his conversations more clipped. He avoided her gaze, the one that held such open honesty and warmth. He saw the questions begin to form in her eyes, the worry etched into the lines around her mouth. "Is everything all right, John? You seem distant," Sarah asked him one afternoon, her voice quiet, a note of hurt barely concealed. She had found him sitting on a bench by the town's small, neglected gazebo, staring out at the empty main street. Dale forced himself to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "I've just been doing a lot of thinking, Sarah," he said, his voice flat, "about where I'm going, about what's next." He offered a vague, rehearsed explanation about needing to move on, to seek new horizons, a new kind of peace. He avoided the truth, knowing a full confession was impossible, that it would shatter everything. The conversation that followed was strained, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. He watched the light fade from her eyes, the warmth replaced by a quiet, resigned understanding. She didn't press him, didn't demand explanations he couldn't give. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands, twisting a napkin in her lap. He felt like a coward, a cruel, selfish man, watching the genuine affection in her face turn to a quiet acceptance of his unspoken rejection. The pain of leaving her cut deeper than he had anticipated, a sharp, unexpected wound in a heart he thought had been hardened beyond feeling. It was a stark reminder of his lost humanity, the parts of himself he had sacrificed for survival. He realized then that he was condemned to a life of perpetual solitude, forever fleeing genuine connection, forever a ghost, drifting on the periphery of other people's lives. The decision to leave Sarah, to once again retreat into deeper anonymity, reaffirmed his identity as a ghost. He was a man forever outside the warmth of normal life, doomed to wander, never to truly settle. He spent the next few days methodically packing his few belongings, his worn books, his simple clothes, the meager cash he had left. Nebraska, too, would become another chapter closed, another identity shed. Before he left, however, he had one final act, a small, quiet attempt at atonement. He drove to the local soup kitchen, the one where he had briefly found a sense of purpose. He looked for Frank, the former colleague who had recognized him, the catalyst for this latest flight. He saw him, huddled in a corner, nursing a cup of coffee. Dale walked past him, a blur in the doorway, and discreetly placed a thick envelope on the counter, filled with a significant sum of cash. It was more than enough to get Frank back on his feet, to offer him a chance at a different path. It was a gesture of lingering regret, a quiet acknowledgement of the burden he carried, a desperate attempt to ease a burden, if not his own, then at least someone else's. Dale traveled further west, beyond the rolling plains of Nebraska, past the jagged peaks of the Rockies, until he found himself in a desolate desert town in Nevada. It was a place almost entirely forgotten by time, a collection of sun-baked shacks and a single flickering neon sign over a bar that smelled perpetually of stale beer and desperation. There was no history here for him, no connections, No meaningful human interaction beyond the grunt of a greeting. It was a blank slate, a canvas for true disappearance. He found work as a solitary night watchman at an abandoned mine miles outside of town. The mine itself was a fitting metaphor for his life. Dark, hollowed out, filled with ghosts and echoes. His shift began at sunset, ending just as the first rays of dawn touched the horizon. His nights blurred into an endless cycle of silent patrols around crumbling buildings and profound introspection. The only sounds were the whisper of the desert wind and the crunch of his boots on the gravel. The vast, barren landscape mirrored his internal emptiness, the endless, unforgiving expanse of his existence. There was no green here, no gentle rain, only rock and sand and an indifferent sky. Loneliness, once a persistent ache, now became his only constant companion, a familiar, unwelcome presence. He stopped seeking human connection, stopped even contemplating it. He embraced the isolation as his chosen fate, a penance for the life he had taken, the lives he had shattered. The ghost of Arthur was no longer a source of terror or guilt, but a quiet, contemplative presence. Arthur sat with him in the silence of the desert nights, a silent witness to his purgatory. Dale accepted his eternal penance, living as a ghost, bearing the immense weight of his choices, forever adrift in a world where he could never truly belong. He started to write, in the small, dusty shack that served as his office at the mine. Under the weak glow of a single bulb, he began to journal. He wrote about Dale Pearson, about Brenda, about Gary, about Arthur. He wrote about the careful planning, the cold calculations, the moments of fear and the moments of perverse triumph. He wrote about Detroit, about Sarah, about the longing for connection and the agonizing decision to sever it. It was an attempt to make sense of his fragmented identity, to bridge the chasm between the man he once was and the ghost he had become. The act of writing offered a strange form of confession, a release he never thought possible. Each word was a step closer to confronting the raw, brutal truth of his decisions, the immense cost of his freedom. He reread his entries, seeing the meticulous detail, the cold logic that had driven him. There was no redemption in these pages, only a stark, unflinching account of a life irrevocably altered by betrayal and a desperate, morally bankrupt act of survival. Dale understood now that he could never truly escape. He could change his name, his appearance, his location, but he could not escape himself. He had merely redefined the parameters of his prison. His survival was not a triumph. It was a perpetual sentence, a quiet, unforgiving reckoning played out under the indifferent gaze of the desert sky. Years folded into each other, like dry desert dust settling into crevices, deepening Dale's isolation in the desolate Nevada town. The sun bleached everything to a uniform pallor. Mirroring the life he now led, John Smith was no longer a disguise. It was simply him. Dale Pearson, the ambitious financier, the betrayed husband, the calculating survivor, was a distant echo, a story whispered by a wind that no one heard. The past was not forgotten, but it was entombed, like the minerals deep within the earth he now guarded. The abandoned mine had become his world, a collection of rusting machinery, crumbling buildings, and vast gaping holes in the earth. His nights were a ritualistic procession, the click of his flashlight beam, the crunch of his boots on gravel, the dry, metallic taste of the desert air. The vast silence was his only companion, broken only by the howl of coyotes or the distant rumble of a passing truck on the highway he rarely visited. The desert, unforgiving and stark, reflected his internal landscape, barren, endless, and devoid of the vibrant complexities of human connection. Loneliness, once a gnawing ache, had transformed into a familiar constant, almost a comfort. He had ceased to seek any form of human interaction. The brief, strained moments of camaraderie in Detroit, the hesitant affection for Sarah in Nebraska, felt like fragments of a dream, distant and unattainable. He understood that his chosen path, his self-imposed exile, necessitated this absolute solitude. He had built his freedom on the graves of others, both literally and figuratively, and the price was a life lived entirely alone. The ghost of Arthur, the homeless man whose life had bought Dale his own, no longer haunted his nightmares with accusatory questions. Instead, Arthur was a quiet, contemplative presence, sitting beside him in the silence, a silent witness to his purgatory. Dale had come to accept this eternal penance. Living as a ghost, bearing the immense weight of his choices, was his fate. It was a life bought at an unthinkable cost, and the terms of that bargain dictated a perpetual, quiet suffering. His journal, started in the Detroit apartment, had grown thick with years of reflections. The pages were filled not with self-pity, but with a stark, unvarnished account of his fractured life. He wrote about Brenda, Gary, Sarah, revisiting their memories with a profound, weary detachment. The initial rage and fear had long since burned out, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable acceptance. He had brought his betrayers to justice, but that act had not brought him peace. It had merely cemented his own condemnation. He understood now, with a clarity honed by years of solitude, that true escape was never possible. He had merely traded one prison for another. The gilded cage of his marriage had been replaced by the invisible walls of anonymity, the bars crafted from his own lies and the life he had extinguished. He felt the physical toll of his choices in his aging body, the invisible burden pressing down on his shoulders. His once sharp features were now weathered, his eyes holding the depth of a man who had seen too much, done too much. His survival was not a triumph, it was a perpetual sentence, a quiet, solitary reckoning that would only end with his death. He would live out his days in this forgotten corner of the world. John Smith, the night watchman, a ghost tending to ghosts. The desert stretched before him, an indifferent mirror to his soul, waiting for the final quiet end. The past years in this desolate desert town have carved lines on my face that weren't there before, deeper than any sun or wind could create. John Smith, the quiet night watchman, is all that remains. The journal, now a thick, dog-eared chronicle, holds the last vestiges of Victor Rodriguez. I read through its pages sometimes, watching the meticulous unraveling of a life, the cold calculation, the desperate acts. There's no longer anger for Isabella or Robert, just a profound, weary detachment. Their betrayal feels like something from a distant lifetime, almost fictional. Arthur, the man whose life I took, remains a silent companion. He doesn't accuse anymore. He simply exists, a quiet weight in the hollow of my chest. I live with the knowledge of what I did, and the silence of this desert is my constant confessor. There's no escaping the truth, only living within its confines. I traded one prison for another, a gilded cage for an invisible one, and the bars are built from my own choices. My survival is a perpetual sentence, a quiet, solitary reckoning that will only end when the desert finally claims me too.